February 8, 1587. A queen, her crown long lost but her dignity intact, walks to her death, unaware that even her final moments would be stolen of the honor they were due. What should have been a swift, merciful conclusion to years of political intrigue became instead one of history's most brutally botched royal executions, a grotesque spectacle destined to haunt the witnesses for all their remaining days. Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots, had commanded armies and ruled nations. She had endured decades of imprisonment, religious upheaval, and palace intrigue. Yet on this cold February morning at Fotheringhay Castle, she would confront her ultimate trial, preserving her royal composure while enduring an executioner's incompetence that twisted her death into a profound public humiliation. The events of that morning would reverberate through the centuries, evolving into a cautionary tale concerning power, justice, and that slender boundary between political necessity and sheer cruelty. This is the story of how a queen died not once, but 3 times before finally finding peace. In an era where royal blood was deemed sacred, Mary's execution signified far more than merely the death of a condemned traitor. It represented the violent collision of dynastic rivalry, religious conflict, and the ruthless pragmatism of Renaissance politics. The late 16th century was a period of unprecedented political and religious turmoil across Europe. The Protestant Reformation had fractured the unity of Christendom, setting Catholic against Protestant in bloody generational conflicts. England under Elizabeth I had risen as a Protestant stronghold, while Catholic powers like Spain and France perceived it as a heretical danger to the natural order. Mary Stuart's very existence presented an existential threat to Elizabeth's reign. As a Catholic with a legitimate claim to the English throne through her Tudor lineage, Mary embodied all that Elizabeth's Protestant establishment dreaded: foreign influence, papal authority, and the potential restoration of the old faith. From her birth in 1542, Mary had been a pawn in the great contest of European politics, married off to secure alliances and exploited as a bargaining chip by forces far greater than Scotland itself. Her tumultuous rule in Scotland concluded in disaster. Accusations of murder, scandalous marriages, and political missteps had cost her the throne. In 1567, fleeing to England, she had thrown herself upon Elizabeth's mercy, anticipating the solidarity of one queen for another. Instead, she discovered herself a prisoner, her fate bound to the changing currents of religious warfare and international diplomacy. For 19 years, Mary had languished in various English castles, a perilous symbol that Elizabeth and her advisers could neither ignore nor safely eliminate. Every Catholic conspiracy against Elizabeth's life appeared to involve Mary as its figurehead, whether she consented or not. The Babington Plot of 1586 would prove the final catalyst, furnishing Elizabeth's government with the evidence required to decisively settle the problem of Mary Stuart. The choice to execute Mary was not made lightly. Elizabeth agonized over signing the death warrant, understanding that killing an anointed queen would establish a perilous precedent. Foreign Catholic powers had already threatened war should Mary be harmed. Yet the Protestant establishment, led by figures like Sir Francis Walsingham and Lord Burleigh, maintained that England's survival hinged on Mary's death. Parliament had pronounced Mary guilty of treason in October 1586, but Elizabeth delayed the execution for months, torn between personal reluctance and political necessity. The warrant was signed in February 1587, though Elizabeth would later assert she never intended it to be enacted immediately. Whether through genuine hesitation or calculated political theater, the Queen's vacillation added yet another layer of controversy to Mary's ultimate fate. The selection of Fotheringhay Castle for the execution was deliberately symbolic. This medieval fortress in Northamptonshire had long been linked with royal authority and punishment. Its great hall, where Mary would meet her end, had observed centuries of political drama. The setting was intended to communicate the gravity of the event while distancing it from London's potentially sympathetic masses. As February 1587 dawned, the stage was arranged for one of the most contentious executions in English history. The religious wars of Europe, the personal rivalry between 2 queens, and the brutal pragmatism of Tudor politics would all converge in a single moment of shocking incompetence destined to echo through the ages. Dawn broke cold and grey over Fotheringhay Castle on February 8, 1587. Mary Stuart had passed her final night in prayer, attended by the loyal servants who had shared her long captivity. At 44, the woman once celebrated as Europe's most beautiful queen bore the marks of nearly 20 years of imprisonment. Yet her bearing remained unmistakably, defiantly regal. The execution warrant had been read to her the prior evening. Mary received the news with her characteristic composure, asking only that she be permitted to prepare her soul for the journey ahead. She spent the dark hours writing letters, distributing her few remaining possessions among her servants, and commending her spirit to God. Her Catholic faith, which had cost her everything, would now sustain her through these final hours. At 8 o'clock in the morning, the appointed officials arrived at her chambers. The Earls of Shrewsbury and Kent, both Protestant nobles who had overseen her captivity, came to escort her to the Great Hall. With them came the Sheriff of Northamptonshire and various other dignitaries, their faces solemn with the burden of their duty. The presence of so many high-ranking officials emphasized the unprecedented nature of what was to occur. Mary emerged from her chambers dressed in black velvet, fitting for a woman in mourning, though whether she mourned herself or the world that had brought her to this point, none could say. Over her gown she wore a white veil, and around her waist, a silver crucifix. The emblems of her faith worn openly, defiantly, even in Protestant England. Her small retinue of servants, including her physician Bourgoing and her secretary Melville, accompanied her on this last walk. The procession moved slowly through the castle corridors, past tapestries and portraits that spoke of England's power and glory. Mary walked with measured steps, her head held high, acknowledging no one. Those who witnessed her passage would later remark on her dignity, her refusal to be hastened or hustled like a common criminal. She remained a queen, and she would die as one. The great hall of Fotheringhay had been transformed for the occasion. A scaffold 2 feet high and draped in black cloth dominated the room's center. Upon it sat a single chair and a chopping block, both covered in black velvet. Wooden barriers around the scaffold held back the crowd of witnesses, local nobility, officials, and carefully chosen commoners who would carry word of the proceedings to the outside world. The executioner stood beside his block, his face concealed behind a mask, his large frame clothed in black. The axe he would wield gleamed dully in the winter light filtering through the hall's tall windows. Every detail had been prepared with meticulous care. Yet no one in that crowded hall could have imagined how terribly the next few minutes would unravel. As Mary entered the great hall, a hush descended over the assembled crowd. This was history being forged, the death of a crowned queen by the hand of her subjects. The very air seemed to thicken with the moment's weight, charged with political significance, religious tension, and a human drama that would be remembered long after every witness had turned to dust. Mary ascended the scaffold with the same measured dignity that had carried her through years of captivity and the corridors of power. The crowd watched in absolute silence as she surveyed the scene of her final act upon the world's stage. Her eyes lingered on the block, the axe, the masked figure who would end her life. Yet her expression betrayed nothing of her inner thoughts. The commission for the execution was read aloud, a lengthy recital of her crimes and the legal justification for her death. Mary listened without emotion, occasionally closing her eyes as if in prayer. When asked if she had any final words, she spoke clearly and without tremor, proclaiming her innocence of the specific charges while affirming her Catholic faith and her hope for England's eventual return to the true religion. With practiced hands, Mary's servants began to help her disrobe. This was the prescribed ritual. The condemned must die in simple attire, stripped of rank and power's external trappings. As they removed her black velvet gown, gasps arose from the crowd. Beneath her mourning clothes, Mary wore a bodice and skirt of deep crimson, the color of martyrdom, the color of the blood she was about to shed for her faith. The symbolism was unmistakable and deliberate. Mary had chosen to die not as a traitor to England, but as a martyr to the Catholic cause. The crimson silk seemed to glow in the hall's gray light, transforming her from condemned prisoner to religious icon before the eyes of all present. Her servants completed their task with trembling hands, their own eyes wet with unshed tears. Mary approached the block with steady steps, pausing only to forgive the executioner for his duty. This gesture of grace, traditional among nobility facing death, gained additional poignancy given the horror about to unfold. She knelt beside the block, arranging her skirts with the same care she might have shown preparing for a court ceremony. The final preparations were completed in tense silence. Mary positioned her head upon the block, whispering Latin prayers that echoed softly through the hall. Her bound hands, clasped before her, held a small crucifix, her final act of defiance in a Protestant realm. The executioner raised his axe. The crowd held its collective breath, and history prepared to witness an atrocity disguised as justice. Those present would later struggle to describe the atmosphere in those last seconds before the axe fell. Some spoke of an almost supernatural stillness, as if the air itself had thickened with anticipation. Others remembered the sound of Mary's quiet prayers, a gentle murmur that seemed to sanctify the barbaric proceedings. All would concur they had never witnessed such composed courage in death's face. The executioner's axe reached its apex, poised to deliver what should have been a swift, merciful end to decades of religious conflict and political maneuvering. In that suspended moment, Mary Stuart ceased to be a political problem and became something far more dangerous to her enemies, a symbol of faith triumphant over worldly power, of dignity maintained in the face of ultimate humiliation. The first blow fell with a sickening thud that reverberated through the great hall's stunned silence. But instead of the clean severance that should have ended Mary's suffering instantly, the axe struck the back of her skull, cutting deep into bone and flesh while missing the neck entirely. A collective gasp erupted from the witnesses as Mary's body convulsed and a low moan escaped her lips, the first sound of pain she had permitted herself. Blood began to pool beneath the block as the executioner, his hands trembling with the realization of his horrific error, raised the axe again. The crowd watched in stunned horror as Mary's fingers twitched slightly, her body still clinging to life despite the devastating head wound. What should have been a moment of solemn justice had mutated into a grotesque spectacle that would haunt every witness for the remainder of their days. The second blow came down with desperate force, this time striking the base of Mary's neck. But the executioner's nerve was shattered, his aim compromised by the horror of his first failure. The axe bit deep, yet did not sever completely, leaving Mary's head hanging by sinew and skin, her lifeblood flowing freely across the black-draped scaffold. The crowd could hear the executioner's labored breathing behind his mask, punctuated by whispered curses and prayers. For long, agonizing seconds, Mary's body lay motionless while the executioner struggled to comprehend the magnitude of his failure. 2 strikes of the axe, and still the deed was undone. The official witnesses stood frozen in shock, uncertain whether to intervene or allow the butchery to continue. Some women in the crowd had turned away or begun weeping openly, while others stared in morbid fascination at the unfolding disaster. The third blow fell with the fury of desperation, the executioner bringing every ounce of his strength to bear on the grisly task. This time, mercifully, the severance was complete. Mary's head finally separated from her tortured body in a spray of blood that spattered the scaffold and the nearest witnesses. The sound of the axe striking the block beneath echoed through the hall like a death knell, marking the end of one of history's most horrifically botched executions. But even death could not spare Mary further indignity. As the executioner bent to retrieve her head, intending to display it to the crowd as was customary, his hands grasped nothing but a wig of auburn curls. Mary's head fell back to the scaffold with a dull thud, revealing her natural hair, thin, gray, and prematurely aged by years of stress and captivity. The beautiful queen who had once captivated European courts was revealed in death as a middle-aged woman worn down by suffering and loss. The crowd's reaction was immediate and visceral. Gasps of shock gave way to horrified murmurs as witnesses processed what they had seen. Some crossed themselves, whether in prayer for Mary's soul or as a superstitious ward against the evil they felt they had witnessed. Others simply stared in stunned silence, their minds struggling to reconcile the dignity of Mary's final moments with the barbarity of her actual death. As if the scene were not grotesque enough, a small commotion near the scaffold drew every eye. From beneath Mary's crimson skirts emerged her little dog, a Skye Terrier that had somehow hidden itself in her clothing and accompanied her even to the block. The tiny creature, its white fur now stained with its mistress's blood, ran in confused circles around the scaffold, whimpering pitifully as it searched for the woman who would never comfort it again. Robert Melville, Mary's secretary who had served her faithfully through years of captivity, stood among the official witnesses with tears streaming down his weathered face. In letters written immediately after the execution, he described the scene as the most pitiful sight that ever was seen, his usual diplomatic composure shattered by what he had witnessed. Melville's account, preserved in the Scottish archives, provides one of the most detailed contemporary descriptions of the execution's horrific mismanagement. Dr. Bourgoin, Mary's French physician, later testified he had never witnessed such incompetence in all his years attending executions across Europe. His medical training allowed him to observe with clinical detachment the executioner's failures, noting that the first blow had fractured Mary's skull without touching the vital arteries, needlessly prolonging her agony. His testimony would become crucial evidence in the subsequent investigation into how such a disaster had occurred. The Earl of Shrewsbury, one of the commissioners overseeing the execution, was observed to have turned pale and begun trembling after the first botched blow. Contemporary accounts describe him as much moved and troubled by what he witnessed, a remarkable display of emotion from a man who had overseen Mary's captivity for years. His official report to Elizabeth I was notably brief, glossing over the gruesome details while emphasizing Mary's dignity and composure. Local witnesses, carefully selected to spread word of the execution throughout the realm, instead carried tales of horror that undermined the government's intended message. A blacksmith from nearby Oundle later told how he had expected to see justice served, but instead witnessed a butchery most foul, unfit for any Christian soul. Such testimony spread rapidly among the common folk, transforming Mary from traitor to martyr in the popular imagination. The executioner himself, whose identity was kept secret for his own protection, reportedly fled Fotheringhay immediately after the proceedings. Later accounts suggest he was found dead in his lodging several days later, though whether from guilt, fear, or other causes remains unclear. His assistant, who had helped prepare the scaffold, was said to have been so traumatized that he abandoned his profession entirely and entered a monastery. Foreign ambassadors, though not present at the execution, quickly gathered detailed accounts from multiple sources. The Spanish ambassador's dispatch to Philip II described the proceedings as evidence of English barbarism and God's judgment upon Protestant heretics. The French ambassador, representing Mary's former in-laws, used the gruesome details to justify increased support for Catholic plots against Elizabeth's reign. Even Protestant observers struggled to reconcile their religious convictions with what they had witnessed. A local minister who had been present to offer Mary final spiritual counsel wrote that while he could not condone her Catholic faith, he had never seen greater Christian fortitude in the face of death. His congregation would later remember his troubled demeanor in the weeks following the execution as he wrestled with the theological implications of such suffering. The immediate aftermath at Fotheringhay was one of shocked silence and hurried cleanup. Servants moved swiftly to remove the blood-stained scaffold materials, while officials debated how to report the disaster to London. The castle's Great Hall, witness to centuries of royal ceremony, had been transformed into a charnel house that would forever bear the stain of that February morning's events. News of Mary's botched execution reached Elizabeth I at Greenwich Palace within hours, carried by swift messengers who had ridden through the night. The Queen's reaction, witnessed by her closest courtiers, was a mixture of genuine horror at the manner of Mary's death and calculated political theater designed to distance herself from the gruesome proceedings. Elizabeth reportedly fainted upon hearing the details, though cynical observers noted her quick recovery and immediate focus on damage control. The international repercussions were swift and severe. Philip II of Spain, already preparing his great armada against England, used Mary's martyrdom as additional justification for holy war against the Protestant heretics. Pamphlets describing the execution in lurid detail circulated throughout Catholic Europe, transforming Mary from a politically inconvenient claimant into a saint-like figure whose suffering demanded vengeance. The botched nature of the proceedings only enhanced her status as a martyr. Pope Sixtus V, who had previously been lukewarm toward Mary's claims, now embraced her cause posthumously. The grisly details of her execution provided powerful propaganda for the Counter-Reformation, with Catholic preachers using the story to illustrate Protestant cruelty and the redemptive power of suffering for the faith. Mary's transformation from troublesome claimant to martyred saint was complete, achieved not through her life, but through the manner of her death. In Scotland, Mary's son James VI faced an impossible political situation. Though he had done nothing to save his mother's life, indeed, had tacitly accepted it as the price of the English succession, he now had to respond to public outrage without jeopardizing his future claims to Elizabeth's throne. His carefully worded protest satisfied neither Scottish honor nor English interests, leaving him politically wounded on both sides of the border. Elizabeth's government moved quickly to deflect blame for the execution's mismanagement. Scapegoats were found among the local officials who had organized the proceedings, while the Privy Council launched investigations designed more to absolve the Crown than to uncover truth. The executioner's convenient death eliminated the most obvious target for public anger, though rumors persisted that he had been silenced to prevent embarrassing revelations. French reaction was particularly complex, given Mary's status as a former queen consort and the mother of James VI. While officially Protestant England and Catholic France were not allies, the French court had maintained diplomatic relations with both Elizabeth and Mary. The execution's botched nature provided ammunition for French Catholics seeking to undermine their country's pragmatic foreign policy, potentially destabilizing the delicate balance of European power. The propaganda war that followed proved more damaging to England than the political elimination of Mary had been beneficial. Catholic Europe now possessed a powerful martyr whose suffering could be invoked to justify almost any action against Protestant England. The image of Mary dying with dignity while her Protestant executioners butchered her became a rallying cry that would outlive both Elizabeth and her realm. Within England itself, reaction divided along religious and class lines. Protestant authorities emphasized Mary's treason and the justice of her sentence while quietly working to suppress detailed accounts of the execution's mismanagement. Among Catholics and those sympathetic to Mary's cause, however, the story spread rapidly, enhanced with each telling until it became a legend of martyrdom that would inspire resistance for generations. The anonymous executioner chosen to carry out Mary's death sentence was reportedly selected for his experience and reliability in such grim work. Executioners in Tudor England were typically professionals who traveled from town to town, their services in demand for the frequent public executions that served as both punishment and popular entertainment. Yet the men who climbed the scaffold at Fotheringhay that February morning would achieve a notoriety that haunted the profession for decades. Contemporary records suggest the executioner had successfully performed numerous previous executions, including those of other high-ranking nobles condemned for treason. The precise stroke required to cleanly sever a head was a skill born of practice and steady nerves. Yet something went catastrophically wrong on February 8, 1587. Whether through nervousness at executing royalty, faulty equipment, or simple human error remains unclear. The psychological toll of his failure was immediately apparent. After the third blow finally completed the grisly task, observers noted the executioner was trembling visibly, his usual professional composure utterly shattered. The ritualistic display of the severed head, which should have marked his duty's successful completion, became another source of humiliation when Mary's wig came away in his hands. Guild records from the period indicate that the executioner's failure at Fotheringhay effectively ended his career. Professional executioners depended on their reputation for clean, efficient work. A botched execution reflected poorly not only on the individual but on the entire profession. Word of the disaster spread rapidly through the network of traveling executioners, making the unnamed man a pariah among his own kind. The executioner's reported death within days of the event has never been fully explained by historians. Some contemporary accounts suggest suicide driven by guilt and professional shame, while others hint at more sinister explanations, perhaps silencing by government agents concerned about potential embarrassing revelations. The truth remains lost to history, but the symbolism was clear. Even the instrument of Mary's death could not escape the tragedy's aftermath. Local folklore in Northamptonshire preserves tales of the executioner's ghost haunting the roads near Fotheringhay Castle, eternally attempting to complete his failed task. While such stories should be dismissed as superstition, they reflect the deep psychological impact the botched execution had on the local community. The event had traumatized not only those present but entire populations that felt the weight of the shameful proceedings. The technical aspects of the executioner's failure became the subject of much speculation among experts. Some suggested Mary's positioning on the block had been incorrect, while others blamed a dull axe or the executioner's unfamiliarity with the specific equipment provided at Fotheringhay. The mystery of how such an experienced professional could fail so catastrophically added another layer of intrigue to an already controversial event. The broader impact on the profession was significant and lasting. Public confidence in executioners' competence was shaken, leading to demands for better training and oversight. Some nobles condemned to death in subsequent years specifically requested alternative methods rather than risk similar botched beheadings. The specter of Mary's prolonged suffering haunted every scaffold in England for years to come. Among all the horrific details, none proved more emotionally powerful than the image of her small Skye Terrier emerging from beneath her blood-soaked skirts. The little dog, which contemporary accounts describe as white with brown markings, had somehow managed to conceal itself in the folds of Mary's crimson dress, accompanying its beloved mistress even to the scaffold in a display of loyalty that moved the hardest hearts among the witnesses. The breed itself was significant. Skye Terriers originated from the Scottish Highlands and were known for their fierce devotion. Mary's choice to keep such a distinctly Scottish breed during her long English captivity may have been a subtle assertion of her enduring identity as Scotland's queen. The dog had been her constant companion through years of imprisonment, providing comfort and affection where both were rare. Witness accounts describe the heart-wrenching scene as the blood-stained animal ran in circles around the scaffold, searching frantically for its mistress and whimpering piteously. The sight of this innocent creature, traumatized and confused by the violence it had witnessed, provided a stark contrast to the political and religious justifications for Mary's execution. Here was pure, unconditional love confronted with inexplicable cruelty. The symbolism was not lost on contemporary observers, nor on later historians and writers who would retell the story. The dog's presence transformed Mary's execution from a matter of state policy into something deeply personal and emotional. Catholics would later use the image of the loyal dog to illustrate the constancy of faith in the face of persecution, while even Protestant accounts struggled to dismiss the scene's powerful emotional impact. Dr. Bourgoing, Mary's physician, took responsibility for the traumatized animal following the execution. Contemporary letters describe his efforts to care for the creature, which reportedly refused food for days and showed signs of deep melancholy. The dog's obvious grief became another testimony to Mary's character. Even her pets mourned her loss with human-like sorrow, suggesting the depth of affection she inspired in all who knew her personally. The fate of Mary's dog became a minor obsession among those who followed the story. Some accounts suggest the animal was eventually returned to Scotland, where it lived out its days under the care of Mary's former supporters. Others claim it died of grief within weeks of its mistress's death, unable to recover from the trauma of that February morning. The uncertainty only added to the pathos of the tale. Artists and writers in subsequent centuries would frequently include the dog in their depictions of Mary's execution, recognizing its powerful symbolic value. The image of innocent loyalty witnessing incomprehensible violence spoke to universal themes that transcended the specific religious and political conflicts of the 16th century. The dog became a symbol of all that was lost when political necessity overrode basic human compassion. The dog's presence also highlighted the personal cost of Mary's long imprisonment. While historians debate the justice of her execution and the politics of her captivity, the sight of her faithful companion reminded observers that behind the royal titles and political machinations was a woman who had lived, loved, and inspired devotion in those closest to her. The dog's loyalty stood as mute testimony to the human dimension of a tragedy that politics had dehumanized. The execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, marked a turning point in European attitudes toward divine right and royal authority. For centuries, the notion that kings and queens ruled by God's appointment had provided theoretical protection even for deposed monarchs. Mary's death at her subjects' hands shattered this assumption, establishing a precedent that would echo through the English Civil War and beyond into the age of democratic revolution. Catholic Europe's reaction to Mary's martyrdom contributed significantly to the climate that produced the Spanish Armada of 1588. Philip II's invasion fleet carried banners depicting Mary's execution, transforming a strategic conflict into a holy war of vengeance. Though the Armada failed, the propaganda value of Mary's suffering continued to inspire Catholic resistance to Protestant rule throughout Elizabeth's reign and beyond. The botched nature of the execution had consequences far beyond the immediate horror it caused. Professional executioners throughout Europe faced increased scrutiny and demands for competency, leading to improvements in techniques and equipment. The image of royal dignity maintained even in the face of incompetent brutality became a template for noble behavior, influencing how subsequent condemned monarchs faced their deaths. In Scotland, Mary's execution complicated the eventual union of the English and Scottish crowns under her son James VI and I. While James ultimately inherited both thrones, the manner of his mother's death created lasting resentment among Scots that would influence Anglo-Scottish relations for generations. The execution became a symbol of English arrogance and disregard for Scottish sensibilities that persisted well into the modern era. The religious dimensions of Mary's death had equally lasting impact. Catholic martyrology embraced her story, and she was venerated as a saint by many believers long before any official recognition. Protestant historians, meanwhile, struggled to reconcile their approval of her execution with embarrassment over its mismanagement. The theological implications of a crowned queen dying for her faith challenged both Catholic and Protestant concepts of divine authority. Literary and artistic representations of Mary's execution began appearing within years of her death and continued for centuries. From contemporary ballads to Victorian paintings to modern films, the story of her botched execution captured imaginations across cultures and eras. The consistent focus on the executioner's incompetence and Mary's dignity suggests something in the tale that speaks to universal human concerns about justice, suffering, and grace under pressure. Modern historians continue to debate whether Mary's execution was justified by the standards of her time, but few question its impact on subsequent European history. The precedent of executing a legitimate monarch for treason would be cited during the English Civil War when Charles I faced the same fate. The concept that royal blood provided no ultimate protection from political consequences became a cornerstone of constitutional government. The forensic details of Mary's execution also contributed to evolving attitudes toward capital punishment. The graphic descriptions of her prolonged suffering provided ammunition for those who questioned whether any method of execution could be considered humane. While such debates would not bear fruit for centuries, the seeds of modern opposition to the death penalty can be traced partly to reactions against spectacles like Mary's botched beheading. The death of Mary, Queen of Scots, serves as a stark reminder that history's great moments often hinge on the competence of ordinary people performing extraordinary tasks. What should have been a clean political solution to decades of international tension instead became a symbol of brutality that outlasted the political circumstances that created it. The executioner's failure transformed a state execution into a martyr's passion, achieving for Mary in death the sympathy and reverence that had eluded her in life. The tragedy at Fotheringhay Castle illustrates how the pursuit of political necessity can strip away civilization's veneer, revealing the violence underlying all state power. Elizabeth's government sought to eliminate a threat while maintaining the appearance of legal justice. Yet the botched execution exposed the essential brutality of their solution. No amount of legal procedure or religious justification could disguise that they had ordered the killing of a woman whose primary crime was existing as an inconvenient reminder of alternative possibilities. Mary's dignity in death stands in sharp contrast to the incompetence of those charged with killing her. While her executioner trembled and failed, while witnesses wept and turned away in horror, Mary herself maintained the composure that had carried her through a lifetime of political turmoil. Her final performance as a queen, for performance it certainly was, achieved more for her reputation than any victory in life might have accomplished. The image of the blood-stained dog searching for its dead mistress provides perhaps the most enduring symbol of the entire tragedy. In that innocent creature's bewilderment and grief, we see reflected the cost of political calculation measured in purely human terms. The dog's loyalty, unstained by religious or political considerations, stands as a rebuke to the complex justifications that brought Mary to the scaffold and left her there to die badly. The lasting fascination with Mary's execution reveals something important about human nature and our relationship with power. We are drawn to stories of dignity maintained in the face of ultimate adversity, of grace under pressure that transcends immediate circumstances. Mary's death became legendary not because she was innocent, the political charges against her were largely accurate, but because she faced an ugly death beautifully. Perhaps the most sobering lesson is how quickly political calculations can spiral beyond their creator's control. Elizabeth's government sought to solve a problem quietly and efficiently. Yet the executioner's incompetence created a propaganda disaster that strengthened the very Catholic cause they had hoped to weaken. The gap between intention and result serves as a warning about the unpredictable consequences of state violence. The story continues to resonate because it combines universal themes, loyalty, betrayal, suffering, and dignity, with the specific historical moment that shaped modern Europe's political landscape. Mary's death marked the end of one era and the beginning of another, a violent transition from medieval concepts of sacred kingship to modern ideas about the limits of royal power. In our own age, when political violence and state power remain contentious issues, Mary's execution offers lessons about the costs of treating human beings as political problems to be solved. The woman who died at Fotheringhay was more than the sum of her religious beliefs or dynastic claims. She was a person capable of inspiring love in a small dog and maintaining dignity in the face of incompetent brutality. That humanity, revealed most clearly in her final moments, may be her most important legacy.